Well, hi there, and welcome to this special edition of my presentation to ARMA Boston on the notion that records are the water in your business process sea. My name is Steve Weissman, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to share my 2 cents about how integral records are to business process management and to the up-and-coming discipline known as information governance. Because I'm a master of the metaphor, let me start with this short clip, which is taken from a commencement speech at Kenyon College some years ago on the importance of awareness.
There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?"
Translating that into us speak, we're going to spend a few minutes here talking about how records management's very pervasiveness, especially in the contexts of BPM and information governance, is precisely why it's so often invisible beyond a certain few departments, and how to think about changing this in the organization you work for. Because if you can't, or you can't convince some other important fish in your particular sea to help, then it will be at your own peril. Oh yeah, before we start, let me just show you the obligatory slide telling you who I am and what I do, so you know why I'm here. I won't read you all the words on the slide, but let me just say that I spend pretty much every hour of every day working with clients who do the same sorts of things you do. In terms of our metaphor, I help them clean up their records and InfoGov waters, and help keep them clean by helping them propagate standardized, systematized business processes. I'd like to start with this photo, which I took on the grounds of an industrial contractor client of mine during one of my consulting visits. They build things like power plants and drilling platforms, so they deal with a lot of pipes and fittings, among other things. So looking at this picture, let me ask you, what do you see? Most people say things like trailers and pipes and spools of cable and other such things. And you know what? They're not wrong. But there's so much more to it than just this. Namely, there's records and information and processes, oh my, in there too. Each of the physical artifacts in this picture has information associated with it about the manufacturer, size and specification, part number, project identifier, PO number, associated invoice, and department-specific information related to things like my client's machine shop, field inspection reports, weld x-rays, and more. Now, historically, this all has been stored in places like this. In boxes, in storage closets, and then in hallways when you run out of room, as my client did. And maybe in a mountain somewhere. But does this information have to be on paper to be important? No, of course not. In fact, it's the information that's critical, not the material it's printed on, even if that material is a screen. Your focus, therefore, has to be on the care and feeding of that information, regardless of delivery medium, format, data type, or geographic location. This is the link to information governance. For done properly, it builds upon and extends the principles of records management to encompass pretty much any kind of information you can think of. It's also the tie to BPM. For where does that information come from? It comes from one sort of business process or another, be it billing or payables or inventory or legal or what have you. Taking records like data along for the ride and dumping it off at the various departments downstream for use and eventual storage. So it's really just one big box full of stuff that streams through our every activity, and yet it's strangely invisible unless there's an issue. Like water in a fragile environment. This notion of a big box of stuff is a cornerstone model of mine, something that I cleverly call Weissman's big box theory of information management. And what it says is that we have to think about our information as if it all lived in one big box that everyone can access when they need to. Subject, of course, to whatever security privileges they're entitled to and other controls and restrictions. The idea is that everything is just in there, and you pull out and work on what you need by running a search on metadata descriptors that have been magically assigned to each bit. Now, the reality, of course, is that it doesn't yet work this way. Your information is all over the place, in different solutions, different formats, different locations, etc. But it could work that way, and today's technology is at a point where there's getting to be fewer and fewer excuses left not to begin doing it. The trick is to think about cutting holes in the side of the box and sliding in lenses so the information inside is presented to people in whatever way they're accustomed to. For instance, in the lines of business, these lenses may look like spreadsheets for people in accounting, or database screens for CRM folk, regular old web browsers for many others, and so forth. On the technology side, IT people take the same essential approach, but their lenses reflect their focus on connectivity, storage, processing, and display. And so we see labels like web services, application development, networking, databases, archives, repositories, and so on. Same box, different perspective. Vendors do the same thing. And while it may, finally, not be as bad as it used to be, they too often view your information needs in terms of the technology they happen to be selling. Workflow, records, content, imaging, mobile, so forth. I can tell when clients have had some vendors in because their questions tend to skew in one technology direction or another. And it can be great fun to stop them and ask, "You Googled on BPM before I came in here, didn't you?" And they say, "How did you know?" The thing is, between all the systems you probably already have in place and the getting to be more broadly functional solutions that are on the market today, it's absolutely a bad idea to think about records and content and governance and all the other stuff as separate beads on a string. If you do, you'll most likely end up with lots of overlap, little synthesis, and huge cost and time overruns, and still, at the end of the day, a lack of a workable solution to your problem. One big reason is that the problem we're grappling with isn't technological at all. Instead, it's all about business best practices for orchestrating all the different disciplines we're talking about. Best practices that are supported by an intelligent mix of the technology stacks we just talked about, but built atop skills and issues you're well familiar with. Things like classification, retention and destruction, security, metadata management, and so forth. You see, records and governance and whatever else you want to call it are remarkably the same things, all steeped in policies and procedures, and all requiring a culture of accountability to which employees at all levels must be committed, be they senior executives, business unit managers, end users, IT folk, records, legal staff, or members of any other affected group. Otherwise, the best technologies and most well-considered guidelines in the world will mean little, and operational standardization and compliance both will go right out the window. Now, there are definite process overtones here, for the best information in the world is valueless if you can't get it from point A to point B when you need to. It's also true that the most efficient processes in the world are valueless if the information they move isn't any good. So the two really have to work together to get you where you want to go. Plus, there's a heavy dose of enhanced collaboration in here as well, to develop and reconcile the needed metadata, to reduce information duplication, etc. So it all requires a culture of teamsmanship, as well as the right mix of enabling technologies, plural. We'll come back to this a little later on. Now, this way of thinking is kind of radical for a lot of people today, many of whom grew up professionally in a world in which information is power, and what's mine is mine ruled the day. So making the big box work requires some dramatic change, and when you get right down to it, that's the hard part, because you're dealing with people, and people will interpret what you're saying every which way from Sunday if given the chance.
What this organization desperately needs is change.
people will misunderstand to their own benefit if you give them the chance to. So it's important to start working right away on changing both their thinking and their behavior. As we get into this, let me just ask, do you have children? Or young nieces and nephews or other small people you spend time with? If you do, you'll resonate to what I'm about to say. Namely, how do you get people to do things they don't want to do, even though you know it's good for them? Things like put on a coat, or clean your room, or tag your content. The answer lies in one simple equation. Change management equals parenting. It's teaching and cajoling and deftly balancing positive and negative reinforcement so you can modify their behaviors to be what you want them to be. Just as with children, it's important to phrase things in the positive. For instance, replacing "don't do that" with "please do this." Like, "Thank you for not smoking." Having said this, though, don't be afraid to enforce the rules once you've made them. After all, good cop only works when there's a real probability that a bad cop is lurking outside. In dire cases, if you can pull this off, it's okay to make habitual noncompliance a fireable offense. This is no one's first resort, of course, and it's not something you want to take lightly. But you have to be able to play this card should someone simply refuse to play along. Otherwise, all you're doing is saying governance is important, but not really that important in the end. A good in-between option is to include proper governance behavior in your annual performance reviews. Tie something to employees' ability to be paid more or get promoted and just watch them get motivated. Of course, this is a longer-term strategy as its very nature dictates that it needs to be rolled out over time. And because it gets applied on more of an individualized basis, its import likely will spread slowly by word of mouth as employees whisper, "I didn't know they really meant it," to each other. Now, you can't just do this in a vacuum. It needs to be part of an overall strategy and managed like a true project, with KPIs and timetables and resources and objectives and a lot of it. Without this, you won't know when you're done or even how you're doing, and no one will take it as seriously as you need them to. Okay, other tips. Train the heck out of everybody. As with kids, you can't expect anyone to do the right thing if they don't know what that is or how to do it. So be sure to explain what's what right from the get-go and reinforce it continually over time. And if you're really feeling ambitious, get HR to include it as part of the new hire indoctrination program so it just becomes part of the "this is how we do things here" rant, along with "there are the bathrooms" and "be sure to take your security card with you or you won't be able to get back in the building." Now with all that, you can see how this could come across as somewhat heavy-handed. And you don't want to lose folks because you made it too hard or too scary. So again, as with kids, make it and keep it as simple and fun as you can. Now nobody likes training, except that it gets them away from their desk for a while. But if you use what's known as gamification techniques, you can turn tests into contests, and maybe maintain people's interest for longer periods by rewarding them along the way. I can tell you as a parent and a longtime Little League coach that earning prizes breeds self-satisfaction, and in this case, everyone who participates gets a prize. And a lot of times, all you need is to be generous with your public recognition, for this usually counts as a reward and it's easy and cheap to do. Now, I realize a lot of this is beyond your direct control, but I wanted to bring it up anyway so that you can begin factoring it in as you swim up, down, and around your company doing your usual work. If I had to sum it up, I'd say, always remember that records management and process improvement and information governance fundamentally aren't technology issues at all. They're psychology, not technology. And nothing will make or break your ability to do what you know you need to do faster than people's acceptance or not of what's going on. With that in mind, one last piece of advice. Phrase everything in terms of what's in it for them. Not what's in it for you, Not what's in it for the company, but what's in it for them. And then maybe you can get somewhere even by dint of your own effort. In the end, what you want is to adopt, promote, and propagate a grand unified view of what you are doing, why you are doing it, and which technologies, again plural, best further your objectives. In quasi-tech speak, you need systems interoperability to get all the silos to work together and create the big box. You need taxonomy and metadata management to bring true findability to everything in the box. You need security to ensure the integrity of the box and its contents. And you need business analysis to ensure alignment with organizational objectives. Okay, we talked about water, we talked about boxes, we talked about parenting, we talked about psychology. Now let's talk about BPM. Some 30 plus years ago, the erstwhile Sun Microsystems promoted the notion that the network is the computer. And while the context has changed, it's remarkable how well the concept has held up. For when we're talking about the capturing of records or the flow of business processes or the care and feeding of information, what we're talking about is using the network, the internet today generally, to hook departments and people up like chips on a circuit board. The idea, and the typical result, is to achieve a much freer flow overall, which leads to a lot more efficiency and much greater visibility from a compliance standpoint. BPM does this, of course, by automating the making of repeatable, predictable, rules-based decisions so that freer flow can take place. Sometimes these decisions are as simple as yes, no, and approve, deny, but sometimes they're not. So you should always include the ability to identify and properly route exceptions for special handling as part of the setup. What's important to us here today, though, is that in pretty much any case of any import, a record is made and kept of what that decision turned out to be. This often is one of the greatest operational mysteries we reveal to our clients, who sometimes, and this is true, don't even know they have a records function in-house. But you know that records are everywhere, even if nowhere else but the simplest of system log entries or the most innocuous-seeming email threads. Getting the rest of your organization to understand this as well is, well, rather more difficult. When explained, many folks seem to get it, but even they tend not to want to do anything about it. In this way, it's kind of like diet and exercise. And in the corporate world, people tend to want to flee from it in primitive fight-or-flight fashion. And even when we do it, it's often under duress, usually because either something bad nearly happened or actually did. Then we can't do it fast enough. The problem is that when we rush, we're prone to cut corners and end up doing what we think are the right things, but cost ourselves in the end. It's like my father used to say on long driving vacations when I was a kid. We may be lost, but we're making great time. And I'd wonder, how do we know? My suggestion for you is to settle in for a longer haul and follow a blueprint that might look something like this. Now, while you read it, let me ask you, do you see a problem with this graphic? Seems to me, step 1 should be, find a bottle. I've talked at you long enough for one session, so let me wrap here with the simple placeholder and reminder that I can help you flesh this framework out in your own context anytime you think it's helpful. Meanwhile, let me leave you with perhaps the most important piece of advice I can give you.
Just keep swimming, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, swimming, swimming.
The work I've outlined often can't be finished in a week or a month or even in a year. So do what Dory is saying, just keep swimming. Because making others aware that record-style governance of all information and process flows is happening all around them is going to take a lot of persistence and persuasion. As I said, I'll help where I can if you ask me to, and I'll even bring the mops and sponges and buckets we need to make our point. That point being that records disciplines are all around us, even though most don't see them. Just as the young fish in our opening video don't see the water they're swimming in. That's what I've got for you today. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. This educational content was brought to you by Steve Weissman, the InfoGov guy, and the Holly Group, your source for bringing order and discipline to the use and protection of your business-critical information.